All right, for this problem, we've got a graph. It's got some interesting things going on here. As we travel from left to right, looks like at -3, 1, we've got a hole in the graph, and then a sharp point here goes down. That is not a hole, that's a solid point, but it goes straight up here to a hole right there. Another sharp point, hole, solid point, and then right here we've got a hole and a solid point above it. So we're going to be asked some questions about the limit of these. Okay, so let's start off with the first one. We've got the limit as x approaches -3, and this little minus sign right there means it's approaching from the left side, the negative side. So we're approaching -3 on the x-axis from the negative side. So if we're approaching from the negative side, we start over here from the negative side and we approach it going this way. So let's follow this graph as we're approaching it from this way, moving along the x-axis, also moving along the graph. Okay, so as we approach this point -3, we notice if we get right to -3, there's a hole there. So a hole does not have a value. That's not a value. That's basically just, well, it's a hole. It's a discontinuity in the graph. So there's nothing, there's no number there. We can't go right there. But if there were something there, as you can see, the graph is headed. Where is it headed to? What value on the y-axis is it headed towards as it's approaching -3 from this left side? And you can see that it's approaching 1 on the y-axis. If there were a solid point there, if there were, it would be at y equals 1. So a limit allows you to basically look at what would happen if there's a hole in the graph, what would happen, and what would happen if there weren't a hole in the graph is that value would be 1. So the limit as we approach -3 from the negative side is 1. Okay, let's go on to number 2. It's asking the same thing, except this time we're approaching from the positive side. Okay, so we look at this thing from the positive side, and you can see we're approaching from this direction to all this stuff. But as we get closer to the graph of the line, as we're approaching -3 from the positive side, it goes to the same number. It's going to 1. Okay, so this answer is also 1, which means the limit, which is the next question, since there's no plus or minus here, then it's just asking what is the limit? Well, in order for there to be a limit, the limit from the left side and the right side have to have the same answer. Okay, and they do. That means they're all 3, 1. If these have different answers, then there's not going to be a limit here. It won't have a limit at all. It would be D and E, does not exist. Okay. What is the value at -3? Not a limit. It's just asking our actual function value at -3. Well, the function does not have a value at -3. It has a limit because we can pretend there's a value there as they approach that point, but it doesn't have a value. So the value on this is undefined because there is a discontinuity in the graph there. Okay. Kind of running out of room, but let's look at this one. We're asked to find 3 things here. The limit as we're approaching -1 from the left, from the right, and overall. Okay, so -1, let's go back up here to our graph. -1's right here on the x-axis. Where's the graph? Well, it's both here, solid point, and here, open point. So this is a jump in the graph right here. Okay, so as we're approaching from the left side, the negative side, we'll follow the graph here, and it looks like it's approaching -2, and there's actually a point there. So when there's a solid point there, then you're good to go. It approaches that solid point, and it gets there. So that's -2 as we're approaching from the left. Now as we're approaching from the right, we look up at this graph, and it's approaching 3 on the y-axis. As we're approaching -1, x approaches -1, the y value is approaching 3. Okay, there's a hole in the graph, but for limits that doesn't matter. We're saying that it's approaching negative or +3. Now, like I said earlier, in order for there to be a limit as x approaches -1 of the function, these 2 values have to be the same as you approach from left and right. Since they do not, we're going to say this is D N E, does not exist. There's no limit. Okay, and what is the function value at -1? Well, the function value there is where there's a solid point. That's down here at -2. So f of -1 is -2. See, up here there's just a hole. That's not a value there. This is the value, -2. So -2. Okay, let's keep going. So we have Again, 3 questions. It's asking us for positive 2 from the left, from the right, and overall. Okay, so here's positive 2. Again, it looks like we got a discontinuity in the graph here. There's a hole, but there's a jump here. This is a solid point. There's the hole. So as we approach from the left, it looks like the function value here is approaching 2. As we go from the right, it looks like it's approaching 1. Okay, so from the left is 2, from the right is 1. 2, 1. Does the value exist? The limit exist, I mean? Well, no, because these two values are different. So again, this is D and E, does not exist. What is the value? Well, just like last time, find the solid point. The solid point's right here. So we get a value at f of 2 is 1. Okay. We're asked the same thing about 4 now. So let's go to 4. 4 is, there's no holes, there's no jumps. So as we approach from the left side, the value is -1. As we approach from the right side, the value is -1. So the limit is also going to be -1. They're all three the same. What's the value there? Well, there's no hole. So right there at that sharp point, the value is -1. So in this case, all of them were -1s. All right, last one. We're approaching 6 from the left, from the right, and what's the overall limit? Okay, here's 6. As we approach from the left, it's approaching 1. Doesn't get there because there's a hole, and the actual point's way up here. But it's approaching 1. And from the right, it's approaching 1. We're talking about the y-axis. Okay, they're approaching 1 on the y-axis. From the left, boom, that's 1. From the right, boom, that's 1. So our limit is also 1 because they're the same. 1, 1, 1. Now in this case, what is the value at 6? Well, the value here is 1, 2, 3. That's where the actual point is. The limits are approaching here, but when we get to that point, it's actually up here. So 3.